So guys, this is a video that explains the diagram, the investment diagram that we give. So generally I ask before we do any of these diagrams, Mr. Klein, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much you know about investment? 10 being extremely knowledgeable, 1 having limited knowledge. They generally give you from a scale of 2 to around 8. No one wants to give themselves a 10, no one wants to give themselves a 1. But essentially guys, you tell them, Mr. Client, that's fine, Mrs. Client, that's fine. What I'd like to do is give you some fundamental background as to how we see investments and how they apply in our eyes. Does that make sense, Mr. Client? Thank you so much. So firstly, when it comes to investment, there's 4 different investments we can get involved in. Now, this is risk, this is return. Obviously, the higher the risk, the higher the return. Would you agree, Mr. Client? Yes, I would. So the first investment is cash. Now you're right, cash in there obviously with a text that doesn't appear as clear. But Mr. Client, when it comes to cash, can you lose money? 99% will go, no, not really, not so much. Okay, but Mr. Client, so you can't lose money when it comes to the cash. I'll say, oh, maybe if the bank goes down, whatever it is. Yeah, okay, so Mr. Client, if you have $100,000, you put that into a savings account, what's the best interest rate you're going to get? They might say, 3%, 2.3%. Make the expectations real, guys. If they come back to you and say 8 to 10%, they're living in the past. But okay, let's say 2 to 3%. Let's say 3%, Mr. Client. Let's be reasonable here. So you have $100,000, you get 2.3%, you made $2,300. Now that's pretty good for doing nothing all year, isn't it, Mr. Client? Absolutely. So, do you have to pay tax on that, Mr. Client? Pause. Don't get carried away by trying to answer the question before you've given it. They'll say, yes, we do. So if you made $2,300, let's say your tax bracket's at 47.5 or 37.5, of that $2,300, you're left with about $1,150 or $1,200. Is that correct, Mr. Client? Yes, it is. So you've basically made 1.2%. Now, in the question of whether you can lose, Mr. Client, what's inflation sitting at right now? I don't know. Let's say 1.82%, that's what it's at the moment. So Mr. Client, have you lost? Yeah, but it's only inflation. Well, yes, it's only inflation, but Mr. Client, let's put inflation into perspective. If 60 years ago your parents put $50,000 underneath the bed so you could buy your first property, that $50,000 would buy a letterbox, wouldn't it? So the only thing with cash is not will you lose, it's how much will you use, because it's almost a guaranteed loss with today's interest rates and today's tax rates. Does that make sense, Mr. Client? Yes, but it still is unnecessary, even when I'll talk about that in some more detail. But from cash, you get interest. You get interest. The next investment is interest. Now, these are things like your term deposits, your growth bonds. Similar in risk, similar in return associated with that. But again, mostly capital guaranteed investment, but there's some facility things that we'll talk about in some detail there. So from that, you get interest. Now, these two together form your conservative investments. So, not dramatic growth, but not dramatic loss in some situations, mainly capital guaranteed. Now, the next investment, significantly more risky, but significantly greater return, is property. Now, Mr. Client, do you believe property can go down? Now, you're going to have mixed reviews about this particular one, but generally the answer is they're going to say no. So, Mr. Client, what I want to do is take you through some statistics. 25% of Australia's population are baby boomers. Now that demographic owns 50% of Australia's property. The youngest of that demographic, Mr. Client or Mrs. Client, is 5 to 6 years away from retirement. So let me ask the question, Mr. Client. If these people are leaving work, so they're limiting their cash flow, and they're going into retirement, what are they going to need to do with their assets? They're going to need to sell, aren't they, Mr. Client? So, if a percentage of this population decides to sell their assets, what happens to the price of property? It's demand and supply, Mr. Client. So essentially, if 1% of that population, let's just say 1% decide they need to sell their assets, that's 2% statistically of Australia's property that then goes in the market. Simple demand and supply. Now the supply has increased, the demand stays the same. That's 2% of all of Australia's properties. So is there a risk associated with that, Mr. Client? Absolutely there is, but that's only one of them. What about the risk associated with not being able to meet the interest repayments? What if the interest repayments go up? What if you can't get the place tenanted? What if the tenants damage and destroy the premises? Yes, your insurance covers the repair, but will it recover the time without a tenant because of the fixes and maintenance? So is there risk associated with property? Yes, there is, but there is a return as well. So from that, you get capital growth and you also get rent. Does that make sense? So the greater the risk, the greater return. The next one on the line, significantly greater risk and significantly greater return, is equities, your shares. Now, from that, you get your dividends and you also get your capital growth. Now, in the context of risk, Mr. Client, I'm going to give you an example. We have two properties here. They're worth $500,000 each, aren't they? Now, if the market drops and they're now worth $250,000 each, how much money have you lost? $500,000. But Mr. Client, your house here looks beautiful. Let's say your house is worth $1 million. Tomorrow, you go to sleep, you wake up, and now your house is worth $50. Mr. and Mrs. Client, can you now afford to buy your groceries? Absolutely you can. Because the only way you make a loss is if you're forced to sell. Does that make sense? So, first point is property is a good investment, but you have to diversify to make sure you never have to sell. Isn't that right, Mr. Client? Now, when it comes to shares and securities, the same thing applies. With shares, with dividends, with equities, with all that sort of stuff, you can actually have multiple investments as opposed to the properties. And they're not debt focused because you can buy shares with cash flow. So all you're risking is the cash flow you've got invested in, and if you can sell your assets, then you get back your money or your loss or your gain. But by diversifying out into multiple investments, having several shares, several investments, then essentially, Mr. Client, your risk is then mitigated compared to property, which is a debt-focused investment. You need a mortgage, don't you, Mr. Client? Now, understandably, Australia and Australians are led to believe that property cannot go down, but because we've all grown up and lived in the age of the baby boomer. Every person who's living today is either a baby boomer or has only lived in a lifetime where the baby boomer generation, which is our wealthiest generation, exists. Does that make sense, Mr. Client? So, equities are riskier than property, but can also mitigate that risk by diversification. But we don't want just shares. We don't want property. We don't want interest. We don't want cash. These two form our growth investments. So what we do, Mr. Client, Mrs. Client, we put a percentage in growth. And we put a percentage in conservative investments. While these are your slow and steady movers, slowly going up and up and up, these are fluctuating up and down, up and down, up and down, and eventually they're going up. But why we do it in this methodology, Mr. Client, is we want to ensure during the downturn, we can then substitute that loss with our conservative assets. And during our upturn, we're win-win. Does that make sense, Mr. Client? There you go, guys. That one's the one for the investment graph. I'm going to do a few more now. All right. Good luck. I'm looking forward to seeing those role plays.